She didn't scream. She didn't fight back. She just covered her head. And that single, silent gesture exposed a secret 14 years in the making. At Blackthorn Estate, nobody draws the attention of Damian Valehart. That is the only rule that matters. But when a quiet housekeeper named Ilara Voss collided with him in the marble corridor and threw her arms over her skull before he could even reach out, Damian stopped cold. Not because she was afraid of him, because she wasn't. She was afraid of something that had already broken her. And men like Damian Valehart do not let mysteries breathe. If this story already has you gripping your seat, hit that like button now and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what Ilara is running from is far worse than anything inside these walls. The estate sat at the end of a private road that didn't appear on any mapping application, behind a gate that required 3 separate clearance codes to open, surrounded by oaks so old and dense they blocked the light, even at noon. In winter, the grounds looked like something preserved under glass, the stone walls gray and permanent, the gravel paths raked clean each morning by staff who completed their work before sunrise and disappeared before the household stirred. Blackthorn Estate was not a home in any recognizable sense. It was an infrastructure, a system. Every person inside it existed to serve a function, and the function of every person inside it was, fundamentally, to remain invisible. Ilara Voss had understood that before she accepted the position. She had applied through an agency, the kind that specialized in placing domestic staff with high-net-worth clients who required discretion above all other qualifications. The intake interview had been conducted not by a human resources representative, but by a man named Croft, who wore a gray suit and asked her 11 questions in exactly 11 minutes, and told her that if she was hired, she would sign a confidentiality agreement before she received an address. She had signed it. She had been given an address. She had taken the position, moved into the staff quarters at the East Wing, and spent the first 6 weeks learning which corridors to use, which hours were safe for transit through the main house, and which rooms she was never, under any circumstances, to enter. She was good at invisible. She had been practicing it for a long time. The housekeeper's rotation at Blackthorn was organized so that senior staff handled the primary residence while newer employees managed perimeter duties, guest quarters, utility areas, the long corridors connecting the West Library to the kitchen complex. Ilara's assignment was the West Corridor. She cleaned it at 7 in the morning before the household's business began, and again at 9 in the evening, after the meetings that she was never informed of and never asked about had concluded. The corridor was 40 feet long, floored in pale marble that showed every footprint, lined with recessed lighting that cast no shadows, and punctuated at the far end by a set of double doors that led to Damian Valehart's private study. Those doors were always closed. She cleaned up to them and turned around. On the morning of the 43rd day, she did not turn around in time. She had come in at 7:15, which was already 15 minutes late because the supply closet key had stuck in its lock, and she'd spent 10 minutes working it loose rather than asking for help. Asking for help meant drawing attention. She moved through the corridor with her cart, working from the south end toward the north, wiping baseboards and polishing the narrow console table that held a single piece of unidentifiable sculpture. Black lacquer, angular, the kind of object placed in a space not to be looked at, but to signal that looking was unnecessary. She was crouched at the far end of the corridor, working the cloth along the baseboard near the double doors, her back to the room, her head down, when the doors opened. She heard the handle turn. She heard the soft percussion of expensive shoe leather on marble. She started to stand. She stood too fast, and her cart was too close, and she turned into him rather than away from him, and the collision happened in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Her shoulder against his chest, her hand catching the edge of the cart as it tipped, the soft crash of cleaning supplies hitting marble, and then his hand, moving fast, reaching toward her to catch her arm before she went down. Her body processed it before her brain did. She dropped. Not fell. Dropped, deliberately, folding inward, her arms coming up over her skull, her shoulders rounding, her chin going to her chest, her entire frame compressing into the smallest possible shape. A sound came out of her that wasn't quite a word, a breath, pulled sharp and held. And then nothing happened. No impact. No sound except her own breathing and the faint hum of the corridor's ventilation system. She became aware, incrementally, of the marble under her knees, of the cleaning cloth still clutched in her right hand, of the absolute silence that had settled over the 40-foot corridor like something physical. She opened her eyes. Damian Valehart had not moved. He stood 2 feet away from her, his hand still extended at the angle it had been when he'd reached for her arm, frozen at the point of contact that hadn't happened. He was taller than she'd registered from a distance. She had seen him twice before, crossing the main entrance hall, always moving, always accompanied by the man named Croft or one of the other individuals whose roles she didn't know and hadn't asked about. Up close, he was different. Not larger exactly, but denser. Dark hair, graying at the temples, cut close. A jaw that looked like it had been set at some point and never quite relaxed. Dark eyes. And this was what stopped her, what made her breath catch a second time. Dark eyes that were not angry, not surprised, not the cold, hierarchical assessment she'd expected from a man who ran whatever Damian Valehart ran. He was watching her the way someone watches an animal that has just revealed in a single unguarded moment the precise nature of its wound. Alara uncurled herself slowly. She got to one knee, then to her feet, keeping her eyes down, grabbing for the cart because her hands needed something to hold. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice came out flat and controlled, the way she'd trained it. "I wasn't paying attention. I'll get these." She began gathering the supplies off the marble floor. Her hands were not shaking. She had learned a long time ago how to make her hands not shake. Damian didn't speak. He watched her collect a spray bottle, a folded cloth, a small caddy of polish. He watched her reload the cart with the methodical efficiency of someone performing a task that required their entire attention, even when it required none of it. "What's your name?" he said. It wasn't a question. It was said the way you identify a variable in an equation. Flat, precise, expecting an answer without performance. "Alara," she said. "Alara Voss. I'm on the West Corridor rotation. I apologize for the disruption, Mr. Valehart. It won't happen again." He said nothing for another 4 seconds. She counted. "Which agency?" he said. "Linden Domestic Staffing." Another pause. "How long have you been on rotation?" 6 weeks. 6 weeks, he repeated, as if he were filing it. Then he straightened. He had leaned forward almost imperceptibly during their exchange, she realized, in the way predators sometimes do, not to threaten, but to see clearly. And he picked up the piece of sculpture she had knocked from the console table, which she had not noticed fall, and set it back precisely where it had been. "Finish your corridor," he said. He walked past her toward the staircase at the south end. She heard his footsteps recede. She heard nothing else. Alara stood with both hands on the cart for a long moment before she started moving again. She told herself it was fine. She told herself it had been 60 seconds of bad luck, an anomaly in an otherwise airtight routine, and that the smartest thing she could do was complete her shift, file nothing unusual in her own internal record of the day, and sleep without replaying it. She had trained herself out of replaying things. It was one of the first skills she'd built when she was 12 years old, and the replaying became unbearable, and she had gotten very good at it over the years. She finished the corridor. She returned the cart to the supply room. She went to the staff dining hall, poured coffee she didn't drink, and sat at the far end of the table where the light didn't reach well, and she told herself it was fine. She had been at Blackthorn for 6 weeks. In that 6 weeks, she had been precise, invisible, and unexceptional. She had done everything correctly. One moment of bad timing did not unravel 6 weeks of correct behavior, but she knew, with a certainty she could not entirely suppress, that Damian Valehart had seen something in that hallway. And men like Damian Valehart, men who built their entire existence on reading people correctly, did not see things and then forget them. She drank the coffee cold and went back to work. The estate's internal staffing records were managed by a woman named Eloise, who occupied a small office adjacent to the main kitchen and who had the manner of someone who had spent 30 years ensuring that no one could accuse her of having a manner. She was efficient, colorless, and thorough. She had hired Alara based on the Linden agency file and a 15-minute in-person meeting in which Alara had answered every question correctly, because she had been answering questions like those correctly for years. What Heloise did not know was that the file the Linden agency had submitted on Ilara Voss had been assembled with care. Work history. 4 positions, 3 verifiable, 1 listed as a private household that had since closed. References. 2 of them real people who would answer the phone and confirm what they'd been prepared to confirm. Identity documentation. Clean. Background check. Passed, because the background being checked was only 4 years old, and 4 years of a careful, quiet life leaves very little to find. What happened before those 4 years was not in the file. Damian Valehart spent the remainder of that morning in his study. He had 3 calls scheduled, a briefing from Croft at noon, and a set of financial documents that required his sign-off before they could be forwarded to the attorneys handling a coastal acquisition that had been in negotiation for 5 months. He completed the calls. He attended the briefing. He reviewed the documents. At 2 in the afternoon, he called Croft back in. Croft was 41, former intelligence. The branch didn't matter. The training was what mattered. And he had worked for Damian for 9 years. He had the flat, patient affect of someone who had learned that most situations resolve themselves if you give them enough silence to breathe in. He came in, closed the door, and stood. "West Corridor housekeeper," Damian said. "Ilara Voss, Linden Agency, 6 weeks." Croft's expression did not change. "I'll pull her file." "Pull the file, then pull everything behind the file." Damian turned from the window. "There's a gap. Find it." Croft nodded once and left. Damian returned to the acquisition documents. He initialed 3 pages before he stopped and set down the pen and looked at the wall, where nothing was hanging, and thought about a woman crouched on marble with her arms over her head and the specific, unmistakable geometry of her body. The way it had positioned itself, not in panic, but in practice, not fear of the immediate, trained anticipation of impact. He had seen that posture before. Not often. Twice. Both times on individuals who had spent extended periods in environments where impact was reliably preceded by a sudden movement toward them. It was the posture of someone who had been conditioned over time to understand that a hand reaching for you meant a hand about to strike you. He had not been reaching for her to strike her. He had been reaching for her to keep her from falling. Her body had not known the difference. Her body had responded to the gesture, not the intention, because somewhere in its history, intention had been irrelevant. That was not background noise. That was information. Croft returned at 6. He placed a single manila folder on the desk and remained standing while Damian opened it. Inside were 2 pages. Linden Agency documentation on the left, Croft's supplementary notes on the right, written in the compact, factual shorthand that Damian had required from him for 9 years. Damian read the left page. Then he read the right page twice. "The 4-year gap," he said. "She appears in current records as of 49 months ago," Croft said. "Social Security trace puts her in a 2-bedroom apartment in Dunmore, Pennsylvania, working for a cleaning service called Harwick Residential. Before that, nothing. No lease history, no credit trace, no employment, no medical, nothing. She didn't exist before 49 months ago. She existed. The records were either purged or were never established under this name." Damian turned the page. "Linden ran a background check." "Linden ran a background check on Ilara Voss." Croft's voice was precise without being pointed. Whatever preceded Ilara Voss was not included in that check because it wasn't under that name. Damian closed the folder. "What's your read?" Croft thought for a moment. He did this literally. He took the time before answering rather than speaking while thinking, which was one of the things that made him useful. Witness relocation, unofficial, or a private identity rebuild, expensive, professional. Whoever built her background built it to pass a standard commercial screening. It wasn't built to pass a deep trace. He paused. "She's not a plant. If someone were trying to get someone inside this house, they'd build a better file. This is someone who needed a new name and did the best they could afford at the time." "Someone's looking for her." Croft didn't blink. "What makes you say that?" "The way she cleaned a corridor for 6 weeks without drawing a single piece of attention to herself," Damian said. "And then, when she drew attention by accident, her first response was to become physically smaller. She wasn't embarrassed. She was calculating exposure." Croft was quiet. "Find out what's behind the name," Damian said. "That may take more than standard channels. Use whatever channels are appropriate." Croft left. Damian sat in the chair behind his desk, in the quiet study, and thought about what kind of threat builds a life from nothing on a modest wage and cleans the same corridor for 6 weeks without once giving anyone a reason to see her, and he decided that it was not a threat at all. It was a person who had learned long ago that visibility was danger. Elara ate dinner alone in her room. She did this most evenings. The staff dining hall was social in a way that required her to manage her edges constantly, to calibrate the right amount of pleasantness, to remember which small details she had volunteered in previous conversations so she didn't contradict them. Alone, she didn't have to manage anything. Alone, she could be exactly as tired as she was. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, ate a sandwich she'd brought up from the kitchen, and ran through the day methodically. The collision had been bad luck. Valhart's attention had been brief and impersonal. He'd asked her name, asked which agency, told her to finish her corridor. That was management behavior. That was a man noting a personnel irregularity and disposing of it. He hadn't called Heloise. He hadn't told her she was dismissed. He told her to finish her corridor. She told herself this was fine. She took her phone from the nightstand and checked it, the way she checked it every evening, not because she expected messages, but because the habit had become its own kind of comfort. 17 contacts, all of them constructed with the same care as the rest of her life. Nothing unusual. She set the phone back down. At 11:15, she turned off the light. At 11:42, the phone buzzed. She was not asleep. She never fully slept. She rested at a depth that allowed her to hear, which was another thing she'd built over the years, brick by brick, without consciously deciding to. She reached for the phone in the dark. The message was from a number she didn't recognize, no area code she could place. The text was 4 words. They know you're there. Elara sat up. She sat very still in the dark room and held the phone and looked at the message. And her heart did something that wasn't quite panic. It was slower than panic, more deliberate, the way a mechanism engages when it has been waiting a long time for a specific signal. She typed back, "Who is this?" 3 minutes passed. 5. The screen dimmed and went dark. She turned it back on. No reply. She set the phone down on the mattress in front of her, facing up, screen dark, and she sat in the dark room in the house she had chosen because it was remote and behind gates and managed by a man whose name created enough ambient fear that people generally did not go looking for things inside his walls, and she understood that something had shifted. A calculation she had trusted for 11 months, the math of Blackthorn as a place of acceptable safety, had just returned a different number. She did not sleep again that night. She went through her room systematically in the dark, checking what she kept there and what she didn't, inventorying the things that were replaceable and the things that weren't. She kept nothing irreplaceable in the room. That was a rule she'd had since before she was 16. You don't keep what you can't afford to leave. She sat on the floor with her back against the bed and watched the room get lighter as morning came, and she tried to think clearly, and she thought about the man in the corridor, the one with the still measuring eyes, and she understood with a clarity she didn't want that he had already started looking. The only question now was what he would find, and whether he would find it before whoever had sent that message found her first. She was still on the floor when Croft knocked. It was 6:40 in the morning. She knew it was Croft because the knock was 3 beats, even and unhurried, the way someone knocks when they are not asking permission, but extending the courtesy of a warning. She had heard him knock on Heloise's office door once, weeks ago, and had filed it away without knowing why. She got up from the floor. She had not changed out of her clothes from the previous night. She ran a hand through her hair once, which accomplished nothing, and opened the door. Croft stood in the corridor in the same gray suit he always wore, or one indistinguishable from it, and he looked at her with the flat assessment of someone cataloging details. The clothes from yesterday, the absence of sleep in her face, the way she was standing slightly too far back from the door, keeping space between herself and whatever was on the other side of it. "Mr. Valehart would like to speak with you," Croft said. "When you're ready." "When I'm ready," she repeated. "Yes." She looked at him. "Does that mean now?" "It means when you're ready," he said again, without inflection. "There's no urgency being communicated on his end, but you should know the invitation is serious." Alara held the door. She thought about the message on her phone. She thought about the 4 words that had come in at 11:42 and had not been followed by anything. She thought about the fact that she was standing in a room on an estate where every exit required a clearance code she didn't have, talking to a man who had spent 9 years learning how to read people, for a man who had spent his entire adult life making sure that whatever he wanted to know, he eventually knew. She thought about running. She thought about it the way she always thought about it. Fast, involuntary, a reflex that preceded logic, and then she thought about where running would take her, and the math did not work. "Give me 10 minutes, she said. Croft nodded. He stepped back from the door. She closed it. She changed her clothes. She washed her face in the small bathroom with water so cold it made her eyes sting, which was useful because it replaced the hollow feeling behind them with something physical. She looked at herself in the mirror for 3 seconds, which was as long as she generally permitted. Then she picked up her phone, looked at the message one more time. "They know you're there," and put the phone in her pocket. She opened the door. Croft was still in the corridor. He walked. She followed. The study was not what she had imagined in 6 weeks of cleaning up to its closed doors. She had constructed it in her head as severe, all dark wood and controlled lighting and the ambient chill of a space where warmth had been deemed functionally unnecessary. It was severe, but not cold. The desk was massive and uncluttered. One wall was books, actual books, not decorative spines. The window behind the desk looked out over the east grounds where frost was still on the grass at this hour, pale and precise. Damian Valehart was standing at the window when she came in. He turned when he heard the door. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the corridor. Not at her face exactly, but at the complete picture of her, the way she carried herself, the particular set of her shoulders, the fact that she had positioned herself 6 feet inside the door and stopped rather than approaching the desk. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine standing." A pause. "Sit down, Alara." She sat. The chair was leather, facing the desk. She sat in it the way she sat in most chairs, upright, both feet on the floor, the posture of someone who has decided that comfort is a vulnerability. Damian came around the desk and sat across from her, not behind it, in a second chair that was turned slightly toward hers. It was a deliberate choice, she recognized. The desk between them would have been a statement of hierarchy. The chairs facing each other were a different statement. She didn't know yet whether she trusted the statement. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I slept." "No." He looked at her without apology. "You didn't." She said nothing. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands loose. Close up, he looked like someone who had not slept particularly well himself, though he wore it differently. It sat under his face rather than on it, a pressure behind the eyes rather than a hollowness. "I'm going to tell you what I found," he said, "and then I'm going to let you decide what to do with that." Her chest tightened. She kept it out of her face. "You ran a trace on me." "I ran a trace on the name in your file." He said it evenly, without defensiveness. "Alara Voss exists for 49 months. Before that, she doesn't." Silence. "I want you to understand something," Damian said. "I'm not interested in reporting you to anyone. I'm not interested in your prior name or your prior situation as a matter of business liability. What I'm interested in is the fact that someone who builds the kind of profile you've built and works the way you've worked in this house for 6 weeks does it because they are hiding from something with enough resources and enough persistence to make running a continuous condition rather than a single event." Alara looked at him. And last night at 11:42 you received a message on your personal phone from an unregistered number. He watched her face. "You don't have to confirm it. I'm telling you because I want you to understand that my interest in this situation is not theoretical." She felt the cold move through her, slow and deliberate. "You're monitoring staff communications." "I'm monitoring network traffic on devices connected to this estate's system," he said. "I'm not reading your messages. I know you received one and that it came from a number that, when my team traced it this morning, resolved to a prepaid cellular purchased in cash at a convenience store in Caldwell, New Jersey, 14 days ago." He paused. "Someone planned that message. They knew where you were before they sent it." The room was very quiet. "What do you want?" she said. Her voice was flat and controlled, and she hated herself slightly for how well she could do that. "Right now," Damian said, "I want to know if you're in immediate danger." "I'm always in some degree of danger." "That's not an answer." "It's the only honest one I have." He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw shifted. Not quite tension, more like someone recalibrating a calculation in real time. "You're not going to tell me anything." "I'm going to tell you that I appreciate the information about the message source and that I'll handle my own situation." "You'll handle it," he repeated. "Yes. From inside a gated estate that you don't have the clearance codes to exit without assistance." He said it without mockery. Just the facts, laid out. "You'll handle it." She stood up. "Am I dismissed from my position?" He stood too, and when he did, the room reorganized itself slightly because he was taller and because there was a quality to him in motion. Not physically threatening, but weighted. Present in a way that made the space around him feel smaller. "No," he said. "You're not dismissed." "Then I have a corridor to clean at 7. She walked to the door. Her hand was on the handle when he spoke again. "Lena," he said. She stopped. The room was absolutely still. She could hear the frost outside, almost. The way you can sometimes hear cold. A pressure. A held breath. Her hand was on the handle, and she did not turn around, and she did not move, and the name sat in the air between them like something that had been in a locked box for a very long time and had just heard the tumblers give. She turned around slowly. Damian was standing where she'd left him. His expression had not changed. "That's what you were called," he said quietly. "Before." Her throat did something she controlled. "Where did you find that?" "A sealed case reference from 14 years ago. Juvenile court record expunged. The name attached to the witness notation was partially redacted. 3 letters remained." He held her gaze. "L-E-N. It wasn't a large leap." "Sealed records," she said. "You accessed sealed records." "I have access to things that aren't generally accessible," he said. "That's not a boast. It's relevant context." She stood in the doorway and looked at him and thought about 14 years of construction. The name, the file, the careful sequence of clean, verifiable life, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, which was the specific nauseating sensation of being seen. "Don't call me that again," she said. She left. She cleaned the corridor. She did it the same way she did it every morning. Methodical, quiet, unhurried. And her hands did not shake, and her face did not show anything, and she was as invisible as she had trained herself to be. A younger woman on the morning staff passed her with a cart and said good morning, and Alara said good morning back. Normal. Inside, she was completely still. The kind of still that comes not from calm, but from the recognition that movement in any direction carries equal risk. She thought about the case. She did not let herself think about it often. It was one of those rooms in her interior architecture that had a door she kept shut, not because she'd forgotten what was inside it, but because opening the door served no function. The case was closed. Had been closed for 14 years. A judge named Harwell Crane had presided over a corruption investigation that had been building for 3 years, involving a city infrastructure contractor named Aldous Prine and a network of city officials who had been accepting payments to steer municipal contracts. Alara had been 12 years old and had seen something she was not supposed to see in a building she was not supposed to be inside. And for 3 months she had been the key juvenile witness in a case that everyone said was going to dismantle the network entirely. And then the case had been dismissed. Procedural grounds. Evidence handling irregularities. The kind of legal language that, at 12, she hadn't understood, but that the adults around her had understood very well. Because within 2 weeks of the dismissal, the social worker assigned to her case had sat her down in a room and explained, with the gentle, flattened affect of someone delivering a prepared message, that for her safety she was going to be given a new identity and relocated to a family in another state. She had not been given a choice. She had been 12. She had spent the next 6 years in a family that was not unkind, but was not hers, in a city she hadn't chosen, under a name that felt like a costume she couldn't take off. At 18, she had aged out of the arrangement and been handed a folder with a social security number and a birth certificate and a letter explaining that the original threat assessment had been reviewed and downgraded, and that she was no longer considered to be an active danger. She had taken the folder and the name and the number, and she had begun building Alara Voss brick by brick, and she had gotten very good at it. What the letter had not explained was that downgrading a threat assessment didn't mean the threat was gone. It meant the agency had stopped looking at it. At noon, she went to the staff dining hall and was pouring coffee when her phone buzzed again. She set the carafe down. She looked at the screen under the table, below the edge of the counter. Same number as last night. You have 48 hours before they move. Don't trust the estate. She read it twice. Then she put the phone back in her pocket and poured the coffee and sat down and drank it. Don't trust the estate. She sat with that for 30 seconds, which was as long as she gave herself, and then she thought about it practically. The message sender knew where she was. They were warning her, not threatening her. The content was protective, not coercive, which suggested either genuine concern or an attempt to flush her into movement. Both were possible. The instruction not to trust the estate was either genuine intelligence or an attempt to isolate her from the only position she currently occupied that had any structural protection. She didn't move. She finished her coffee. At 2 in the afternoon, Croft appeared at the door of the supply room where she was restocking her cart. "He'd like to see you again," Croft said. "Tell him I'm working." Croft was quiet for a moment. "He said to tell you that what he found this morning changed the scope of the conversation." She stopped restocking. "What did he find?" "He'll tell you himself." She looked at Croft. He had the face of a man who had spent years not reacting to things that warranted reaction. Whatever Damian had found, it had been enough to alter Croft's baseline register. Not dramatically, but she could see it in the set of his mouth, the slight additional stillness. She set the restocking supplies down and went. Damian was at his desk this time. Behind it, which was different from this morning, he had a laptop open and a printed document face down beside it. When she came in, he looked up and then stood, not from formality, she thought, but from something else, a discomfort that needed to occupy vertical space. "Sit down," he said. "What did you find?" He picked up the document and held it out to her. She crossed the room and took it. It was 3 pages, printed on plain paper, no letterhead. The top page was a photograph, grainy, pulled from what looked like a surveillance still, of a man she didn't recognize. 50s, well-dressed, heavy through the jaw, with the particular groomed confidence of someone who had never once doubted that a room would rearrange itself for him. "His name is Victor Ashford," Damian said. "He's a corporate strategist, investor, and board member of 6 organizations across 3 states. He is also, based on what Croft's team pulled last night, the man who financed the legal intervention that killed the Prime corruption case 14 years ago." Alara looked at the photograph. "He didn't just buy the dismissal," Damian continued. "He built the architecture around it. The judge, the procedural irregularities, the witness relocation. All of it was managed and financed through a shell structure that Croft has been tracing since 4 this morning." A pause. Victor Ashford did not want that case to reach a verdict because if it had, it would have exposed his own financial relationship with Aldous Prine and the network. He is not a peripheral player. He is the reason the case ended. She turned to the second page. Financial records. Numbers that meant nothing to her individually, but assembled into a shape she could feel even without understanding the specifics. "Why is he looking for me now?" she said. "Because the attorney who managed the original suppression died 6 weeks ago," Damian said. "Heart attack. And apparently he was not as careful with his personal records as Ashford believed. A journalist in Caldwell has started pulling at the thread." He paused. "Ashford is running cleanup. He's going back through every element of the original case." Alara set the papers down on the desk. She looked at Damian. "You said all of it was managed, the witness relocation." She kept her voice level. "He knew where they sent me." "Yes." "He's always known." Damian looked at her steadily. "That's the most likely conclusion." She sat down. Not because he'd asked her to, because her legs made the decision before she did, a rare moment of physical insubordination that she didn't have the bandwidth to override. She sat in the chair in front of his desk and she thought about 11 months at Blackthorn Estate, which she had chosen because it was remote and private and protected. And she thought about the message, "Don't trust the estate." and she thought about the specific structural question of how someone who had always known where she was had allowed her to run for 14 years before deciding that running was no longer acceptable to them. "Why now?" she said, more to herself than to him. "The journalist," Damian said, "and something else." He turned the laptop toward her. On the screen was a document, a court filing, recent date. A civil case, filed 8 weeks ago, 3 plaintiffs, all connected to the original Prine case. They're claiming wrongful suppression of evidence. He paused. If that case gets traction, buried testimony becomes relevant again, including testimony from witnesses who were relocated. Including hers. She looked at the laptop screen. She looked at the filing date. 8 weeks ago. 1 week before she had accepted the position at Blackthorn. She had thought she was choosing the estate. She had thought the decision was hers. The room felt different, smaller. "Alara." Damian's voice was not gentle exactly. It was careful, which was different. "I want to offer you something. Not protection in the way you're probably interpreting that word. I'm not interested in positioning you as an asset or managing your situation for my own ends." He leaned forward. "I want to tell you that whatever is in the records we're pulling, if it involves my organization or resources in any way, I will not bury it. And if you decide to stay inside these walls for the next 72 hours while Croft finishes the trace, I will not use that against you." She looked at him for a long time. "You're not a generous man." "No," he said. "So what do you get from this?" He was quiet. Then, "The attorney who died, his name was Reeves. Bernard Reeves." He turned the laptop back toward himself. "Bernard Reeves managed 3 of my father's personal legal matters between 2001 and 2009. He looked at her. "I don't know yet what that means, but I intend to find out." The room held that information for a moment. "Your father," she said. "My father built this estate and the organization that runs from it," Damian said. "He's been dead for 4 years. I inherited everything, including the things I didn't know I was inheriting." His voice was flat, but underneath the flatness was something that had edges. "I would like to know if one of those things is a connection to the network that destroyed your childhood." Alara sat in the chair and looked at the man across the desk and thought about 14 years of running and the message on her phone and the name she had not used since she was 12 years old, which had come out of a stranger's mouth this morning like something he'd been carrying for her without asking. She thought about the 48 hours the second message had given her. She thought about the civil case and the journalist in Caldwell and the man in the grainy photograph with the groomed confidence of someone who had never once believed he would be held accountable. She thought about what it had cost her to build Alara Voss out of nothing, year by year, and what it would cost to dismantle her. She took the phone out of her pocket and held it so that Damian could see the screen, and she opened the messages, and she showed him both of them without saying anything. He read them. His face did something. Not much, but enough. "When did the second one arrive?" "Noon, staff dining hall." He looked up. "They know you're still inside. They're tracking the phone." "Or they have someone inside," Croft said from the doorway. Both of them turned. Croft stood in the doorway with a second folder, thinner than this morning's, and his baseline stillness had shifted another degree. "I need you to see this," he said to Damian. Then he looked at Alara. "Both of you." He came in and set the folder on the desk. Inside was a single page. A staff roster, Blackthorn Estate, current quarter. Croft's finger moved to a name halfway down the list. "Patrick Grund," he said. "Grounds and perimeter maintenance, 18 months. He looked at Damian. He made 3 calls from the estate grounds in the last 72 hours to a number registered to a holding company in Delaware. The holding company, when I traced it this morning, is one of 6 entities connected to Victor Ashford's investment structure." The silence in the room was the kind that has weight. "He's been here for 18 months, Damian said. "Yes." "Before she arrived." "Yes." Alara looked at the roster, at the name, at the fact that Victor Ashford had placed someone inside Blackthorn Estate 8 months before she had ever applied through the Linden Agency, which meant he hadn't been waiting for her to come here. He had been building a presence here for reasons that had nothing to do with her. And she had walked into it anyway. And the net had been right there, invisible and patient for the entirety of the 6 weeks she had spent believing she was hidden. She looked up from the roster. She looked at Damian. He was looking at her. "Don't trust the estate," she said quietly. "That wasn't about you." "No," he said. "It was about Grund. And whoever sent you that message knew he was here." He paused. "Which means whoever sent you that message also has eyes on Ashford's network." Croft's voice was flat and certain. "We have a leak running in both directions, and the evidence Ashford is trying to destroy is scheduled to be moved to a private storage facility in 71 hours. 71 hours. Alara said the number in her head twice, the way you press a bruise to confirm it's real. Croft was still standing in the doorway with the thin folder and the flat effect of someone who had already processed the information and moved on to the question of what to do with it. Damian was looking at the staff roster, at the name Patrick Grund, with an expression that Alara was beginning to recognize. Not anger exactly, but the specific quality of stillness that preceded anger in a man who had learned to keep the two things separated. "Where is Grund now?" Damian said. "East Perimeter," Croft said. "His shift started at noon. He's scheduled through 8. Pull him in." "On what grounds? If he knows we've identified him and we move too fast, he burns the contact channel before we can trace it upstream." Damian looked up from the roster. "Then we don't let him know we've identified him." "Surveillance only. Let him make the next contact naturally." "Yes." Croft nodded and left. The door did not close fully behind him, left an inch of gap, which Alara understood was deliberate. Croft did not make unconsidered choices. The open door was a statement about the nature of the conversation remaining in the room. Alara was still holding her phone. She became aware of it, the way you become aware of something in your hand that has been there long enough to stop registering as weight. She set it on the desk. 71 hours, she said. 70 now, Damian said. He looked at her. The storage facility is in Marin County. Private installation, climate-controlled, registered to a real estate management company that Croft traced to the same Delaware holding entity as Grund's calls. Whatever Ashford is moving there, it's going in, and it's not coming back out. What is he moving? Documents, physical archive. Based on what Croft's team has pulled from the civil case filing, the plaintiff's attorneys have been trying to subpoena a specific set of records from the original Prime investigation, financial correspondence, meeting transcripts, a witness log from the suppression period. All of it disappeared when the case was dismissed. He paused. If it still exists, Ashford has it, and he's moving it to a facility where it will be beyond the reach of any subpoena, civil or otherwise. Alara thought about a 12-year-old in a room shit with a social worker and a prepared message, and no choice. She thought about the 3 months before the dismissal, the interviews, the careful handling, the adults who had told her that what she had seen and what she remembered mattered, that it was going to count for something. It had counted for nothing. There are other victims in that witness log, she said. Almost certainly. People who went through the same relocation, the same erasure. Yes. She looked at the photograph of Victor Ashford still face up on the desk, the groomed confidence, the jaw like something carved. If that archive is destroyed, the civil case collapses. And any criminal investigation that follows, Damian said. The plaintiffs don't have the resources to rebuild the evidentiary chain from scratch. Ashford knows that. This is not a precautionary move. It's a finishing move. Alara picked up the photograph. She studied it for a moment with the deliberate attention of someone building a file in their head. Then she set it back down and looked at Damian. What are you proposing? I'm not proposing anything yet, he said. I'm still establishing what I know. He moved around the desk and pulled the second chair, the one from this morning, closer to the desk, and sat in it. Not the power position behind the desk, the position across from her even, which she noted without deciding yet what it meant. I need you to tell me what you saw 14 years ago, not the version from the case file, what you actually remember. She looked at him. I know that's not a small ask, he said. It's not an ask I've responded to in 14 years, she said. I know that too. The room was quiet. Outside the window, the frost had melted off the east grounds and the grass was dark with it, the kind of green that comes from cold and wet and pressure. She had not told anyone, not the whole of it. She had told the investigators 14 years ago the precise minimum required, but what she had seen, where, the specific names she'd heard, the document she had partially read before the door had opened, and a man had seen her and her childhood had ended in the space of 4 seconds. She had told the investigators those facts, and she had held the rest of it, the texture of it, the specific quality of the fear, in the locked room behind the closed door for 14 years. She opened the door. "I was 12, she said. My mother cleaned office buildings, night shift, commercial district. I used to go with her sometimes when the school schedule allowed it. She couldn't afford evening care, and I was old enough to stay quiet and out of the way. I'd do homework in the service corridors. Wait." Damian said nothing. He sat and listened with the complete stillness of someone who understood that interrupting was a form of erasure. The Prime Group had offices on the 14th floor of the Caldwell Commerce Building. My mother cleaned floors 12 through 16 on a rotation. The 14th floor was supposed to be empty by the time we got there. 11 at night, everyone gone. Usually it was. She stopped. She breathed through the pause deliberately, the way she'd been taught, the way she'd practiced. That night there were lights on in the corner conference room. My mother told me to wait in the service hall. I waited. She stopped again. "The door wasn't closed all the way," she said. "I could hear voices. I was 12 and I was bored and I was curious and I did what a 12-year-old does, which is move closer without thinking about what moving closer might cost." She looked at the window. "I saw 4 men around a conference table. I knew one of them because his face had been in the newspaper. It was Aldous Prine, the contractor whose name was on the building directory. I didn't know the others. Not then." She paused. There were documents on the table, binders, folders. One of the men was going through them, marking pages, passing them around. They were talking about payments, amounts, names of city officials. One of them, not Prine, the one at the head of the table, said something like, "Crane won't be a problem. Crane's been taken care of." And then he said a number, a payment amount. She looked back at Damian. "I didn't understand all of it. I understood enough. And the man at the head of the table looked up at the wrong moment and saw me in the doorway." "Did you run?" Damian said. "I ran." "Did he follow?" "Someone followed, not him, one of the others. I made it to the service stairwell and down 4 flights, and to my mother, and I told her we had to leave, and she could see from my face that I wasn't being dramatic." She exhaled. "We left. 3 days later, 2 investigators came to our apartment and told us they'd received an anonymous tip identifying us as potential witnesses. My mother never found out where the tip came from. I think now that it came from inside Prine's organization, someone who wanted the case to move, who saw an opportunity. Or someone who wanted to identify you specifically," Damian said. She had thought this herself, not at 12, at 22, when she was building Alara Voss and had enough distance to look back at the geometry of it. "That's possible," she said. "Either way, we became witnesses. And 3 months later, the case was dismissed, and we were separated and relocated, and I never saw my mother again." The last sentence landed in the room without drama, without the weight of performance. Just the fact of it, flat and permanent. Damian was very still. Separated. They told me it was for security, that splitting us up reduced the risk profile, that she was being relocated to a different state under her own protection arrangement. Alara looked at her hands. I believed them. I was 12. A pause. I tried to find her later. When I was 18 and had the agency file in the new documents, I spent 8 months looking. I found a death record for a woman matching her description in a county outside Cincinnati, dated 14 months after the relocation. Cause of death listed as a car accident. The room held that. "I don't know if it was an accident," she said. Damian stood up. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her for a long moment, and she could see in the set of his shoulders the thing that had edges underneath the flatness. And whatever it was not pity, which was the only thing she would have been unable to tolerate. He turned around. "The man at the head of the table," he said, "when you saw his face." "I didn't know him." "But you would recognize him." "Yes." He crossed the room back to the desk and turned the laptop toward her. On the screen was a photograph. Different from the grainy surveillance still, this was a professional headshot, A man in a dark suit against a neutral background, taken perhaps 10 years ago. The jaw. The groomed confidence. Older than in her memory, but the bone structure doesn't change. Alara looked at the photograph on the laptop screen. She looked at it for 4 seconds. "That's him," she said. "That's the man who saw me in the doorway." "Victor Ashford," Damian said. "He was there that night. He wasn't a financier watching from a distance. He was in the room." "He was running the room," Damian said. "He was the architect of the payment network, not a peripheral investor. Prine was the face. Ashford was the structure." He paused. He saw a 12-year-old girl in a doorway, and within 72 hours the anonymous tip had reached investigators, and within 3 months he'd purchased the dismissal, and within 2 weeks after that, you and your mother had been removed from the equation. He stopped. "He didn't relocate you for your protection, Alara. He relocated you to control the variable." She sat very still. She thought about the word variable. She thought about a social worker with a prepared message and a girl who had been told she was being kept safe. "He's known where I am every time," she said. "Every time." The other relocations. After I left the family at 18, when I moved to Dunmore, when I came here. The relocation system that handled your case was run through a private contractor rather than a government program, Damian said. "That's unusual. That's the kind of structural choice that requires someone with both legal access and private financing to arrange. Ashford had both." She understood then, fully, with the cold completeness of something snapping into place, that she had never been hidden. Not once. Not for 14 years. Every city, every name, every careful construction of invisible life had happened inside a perimeter that Victor Ashford controlled. She had been running inside a room, and the room had always had walls she couldn't see. Her hands were on the arms of the chair. She became aware of this and did not move them. "Croft," she said. "He's been tracing this since 4 this morning. How much of this has he confirmed?" "The Ashford-Prine financial connection is confirmed. The shell structure around the storage facility is confirmed. Grunt's calls are confirmed." Damian paused. "The relocation contractor connection, that's still being traced, but Croft's confidence level is high." "High," she said. "Not confirmed." "Not yet." She nodded once. Then she picked up the photograph of Ashford from the desk and looked at it again. The man who had looked up from a conference table and seen a 12-year-old in a doorway and decided, in the time it takes to make a decision that will define the next 14 years of another person's life, that the easiest solution was to make her manageable rather than make her disappear. She had spent 14 years being grateful, on some buried level, that she had not been made to disappear. She was done being grateful for that. "I want to see everything Croft has," she said. "All of it. I want to see the financial records, the case connection, the shell structure. I want to understand the full architecture before I decide anything." Damian looked at her. "You're not deciding to run." "I haven't decided anything yet," she said. "I want the information first." He called Croft. Croft spread the materials across the conference table in the small room adjacent to Damian's study. Printed documents, laptop screens, a whiteboard that he'd begun to fill with names and connecting lines before they'd arrived. He walked them through it with the efficient, sequential brevity of someone who had done this kind of briefing in contexts that did not allow for imprecision. The Prime Financial Network, established over 7 years, involving 11 city officials across 3 municipal departments, facilitated through 4 shell companies, managed at the top level by a legal firm, Reeves, Aldgate and Partners, with Bernard Reeves as the primary handler. Total estimated payments, north of $40 million across the full run of the network. Victor Ashford's role, not investor, but architect. He had built the payment routing, established the shell entities, recruited Reeves, and maintained the judicial relationship with Harwell Crane through a combination of financial arrangement and what Croft described in his flat shorthand as leverage material, which meant that whatever Crane had been given to make the case disappear, it was not only money. The witness relocation, contracted through a private firm called Palliser Security Solutions, which had operated for 11 years before closing quietly in 2019. Palliser had government adjacency, former agency personnel, legitimate contracts, Enough infrastructure to manage identity documentation at a credible level. They had handled 6 relocations connected to the Prine case. All 6 individuals were in Croft's records. Of the 6, 2 were confirmed dead. 2 were unlocated. One was Patrick Grund, currently on the east perimeter of Blackthorn Estate. Alara stopped him. "Grund," she said. Grund was a relocated witness. Croft looked at her. Relocated and subsequently flipped. At some point in the last 3 years, Ashford's team made contact with him and converted him from a liability into a surveillance asset. He paused. He's been at Blackthorn for 18 months. His references were clean because Palliser built them. Another pause. He's not here because of you. He was placed here because of the estate's proximity to the Marin County facility. Blackthorn is 12 miles from the storage location. He's been providing logistical intelligence about the corridor, the road access, the timing of perimeter rotations. For what? Damian said. For the transport, Croft said. The archive isn't just being moved to the facility. It's being moved through this corridor. The route passes within 2 miles of the estate's east road. The room absorbed that. He put a man inside my house to map the road outside it, Damian said. His voice had gone to a place that was quieter than his normal voice, which was worse than louder would have been. Yes, and the transport is in 70 hours. 68 now. Damian looked at the whiteboard. He looked at the names and the lines between them, and the structure that Croft had drawn in dry erase marker with the clean architectural precision of someone who had been reconstructing exactly this kind of network for most of his professional life. Then he looked at Alara. She was looking at the whiteboard too. She was looking at the 6th name in the relocated witness list, which she had already seen, which she had not said anything about yet, because she was still deciding whether what she was feeling about it was information or reaction. The 6th name was not hers. It was listed as a relocated juvenile witness, case connection, Prine, age at relocation, 8 years old, 8 years old. There had been a child younger than her in that building, a child she had not known about, whose existence had been buried in the same sealed records for 14 years. Where's the 6th witness? She said. Croft's pause was brief but present. Unlocated. What does unlocated mean? It means Palliser's records for that individual are incomplete. The relocation was initiated, but the trail drops out after the first 6 months. A child, Alara said. 8 years old. The trail drops out after 6 months. Yes. She looked at the whiteboard for a long time. She thought about the 2 confirmed dead. She thought about her mother in a county outside Cincinnati and a cause of death listed as a car accident. She thought about what it meant to be unlocated in a file managed by the same private contractor who had flipped Patrick Grund. She thought about what Victor Ashford did with variables that became inconvenient. The archive, she said. The physical records Ashford is moving. The witness log. Yes, Croft said. The 6th witness's full identity would be in that log. If the log is complete, yes. She looked at Damian. He was already looking at her. He had understood a beat before she'd finished the sentence where she was going. She could see it in the quality of his attention. That shift, that realignment toward a conclusion neither of them had planned to arrive at. We have to intercept the transport, she said. Alara. Not for me, she said. The 6th witness. If that archive is destroyed, whoever that child became doesn't exist in any record. No identity. No case connection. Nothing. She held his gaze. If they're still alive, they don't know what they're connected to. They have no idea that in 68 hours, the last documentation of their original identity goes into a climate-controlled room and never comes out. The silence in the room was the kind that happens when everyone present understands that the conversation has just moved past the point where any of them can claim they didn't know what they were choosing. Intercept a transport on a public road, Damian said. Against a man who has been doing this for 20 years without a single public exposure, with 68 hours to plan and a compromised asset on my own perimeter. Yes, she said. Croft said from the whiteboard, There's something else. They both looked at him. He uncapped a second marker and wrote a name in the upper corner of the whiteboard, separated from the other names by a horizontal line. He stepped back. The name was Aldous Valehart. Damian went still in a way she hadn't seen yet, complete and sudden, like something shutting off. My team pulled his personal correspondence archive from the Reeves estate records this morning, Croft said. His voice was careful without being gentle. Bernard Reeves maintained physical files on all significant clients. Aldous Valehart, your father, retained Reeves, Aldgate, and Partners beginning in 2003. The retainer was significant. The scope of the legal work is documented. He paused. He knew what Reeves was. He used Reeves specifically because of what Reeves was. There are 3 letters in the archive from your father to Reeves referencing the Prine case by name and expressing in direct language his interest in the outcome of the dismissal proceedings. Damian looked at the name on the whiteboard. He looked at it for a long time. He had a financial interest in the Marin County corridor, Croft continued, infrastructure contracts predating the estate's construction. The Prine Network's municipal reach included 2 county contracts that benefited the Valehart land holdings directly. He set the marker down. Your father was not the architect, but he was a beneficiary who chose to remain informed rather than ignorant. The room was completely silent. Alara looked at Damian. She watched him stand in front of a whiteboard that had his father's name on it, connected by a dry erase line to a network that had relocated her at 12 years old and possibly killed her mother and erased a child's identity at 8. And she watched him process it with the particular quality of a person for whom the ground has just moved and who has not yet decided whether to acknowledge the movement. He turned away from the whiteboard. He walked to the window. He stood there for a long time. When he turned back, his face had settled into something she couldn't fully read. Not closed exactly, but reconfigured. The thing with edges had come fully to the surface and then gone somewhere internal, compressed into something that would fuel rather than express. Croft, he said, what do we need to intercept that transport? Croft looked at him steadily. 48 hours of planning, a 4-person team, a legitimate legal mechanism to receive the evidence once we have it, and a witness whose testimony can establish chain of custody on the original case materials. He paused. The last item is not optional. Without a credentialed witness, anything we intercept is inadmissible. The evidence needs someone who can testify to its authenticity and connection to the original proceedings. Both of them looked at Alara. She understood what was being asked. Not in words, in the specific weight of 2 men looking at her in a room where the whiteboard held her history and the history of people who had been managed and erased and converted and buried, and the only remaining variable that Ashford could not control was standing in front of them in a chair with both feet flat on the floor. She had spent 14 years building a life designed to make her invisible. She had built it room by room, name by name, city by city, with the precision of someone who understood that survival required the complete suppression of the one thing that would have made survival unnecessary, her voice. She thought about the 6th witness, 8 years old, unlocated. She thought about her mother. She thought about the conference table and the 4 men and the door that wasn't all the way closed, and the 12-year-old who had moved closer without thinking about what moving closer would cost. She thought about the cost. She thought about who was still paying it. What do you need from me specifically? She said. Croft said, a formal recorded statement establishing your identity as a witness to the original proceedings, your connection to the case, and your authentication of the archive materials upon retrieval. He paused. It requires you to use your legal name, your original name, on record. The name she had not used since she was 12 years old, the name that Damian had said in a corridor that morning like something he'd been carrying for her. She sat in the chair with both feet on the floor, and she thought about the architecture of the last 14 years and what it would mean to dismantle it deliberately, voluntarily, in a recorded statement that would attach her real name to a federal evidence chain. She thought about running. One last time. The reflex, involuntary, preceding logic. Then she let it go. Set up the recorder, she said. Croft moved toward the door. Damian was still looking at her. His expression had something in it she didn't have a word for yet. Not admiration, not relief, something older and more complicated than either. The look of a man who has just watched someone make a decision that cost them something real. Croft opened the door and a figure was standing on the other side. Not waiting, not posed. Someone who had been moving past and had stopped because the door had opened. and Alara had a single second to process the face before the figure moved. Patrick Grund looked at Croft. He looked at the room, at the whiteboard, at the names, at the horizontal line with Aldous Valehart written above it in red marker. His eyes moved fast, cataloging, and in the half-second before Croft's hand came up, Grund's right hand went to his pocket and came out with a phone, and his thumb was moving, and Croft crossed the distance in 2 steps and took the phone before the message sent, and Grund did not fight it, which was worse than if he had. He went still and looked at Damian across the room with the flat, finished expression of someone who has just made the calculation that the asset is burned and the only remaining question is damage control. "How much did you hear?" Damian said. Grund said nothing. "How much did you hear?" Damian said again, and his voice was the quietest it had been all day. Grund looked at the whiteboard one more time. Then he looked at Alara. "Enough," he said, "to know that you just made yourself the most dangerous person Ashford has encountered in 20 years. He looked at her with something that was not quite warning and not quite apology. And enough to know that he already has someone at the storage facility who has been authorized to act if the transport is interfered with." He stopped. "He's not just moving the archive. He's moving it as bait." The room reconfigured itself around that sentence. 71 hours had become 68 had become the present moment, and the present moment had just become a trap, with Alara's recorded name at the center of it, and the only person in the room who had known that until 30 seconds ago was a man who worked for Victor Ashford, and who had just told them anyway, and none of them knew yet what that meant or what it was going to cost. Nobody moved for 3 seconds. 3 seconds is not a long time in most circumstances. In a room where a man who has been surveilling you for 18 months has just told you that the thing you are planning to do is a trap, 3 seconds is long enough to feel the floor shift under the entire architecture of what you thought you knew. Croft had Grund's phone. Grund had his hands at his sides, loose, not threatening. The posture of someone who has made a calculation and is waiting to see if the calculation was correct. Damian was looking at him with the quiet that preceded everything. Alara was looking at the door behind Grund, the corridor beyond it, the geometry of the house around them, running exit math without deciding yet whether the math was relevant. Damian said, "Us, bait for what?" Grund said, "For her." He looked at Alara, not with hostility, with the tired specificity of someone who has been carrying information they didn't choose to carry. "Ashford doesn't need the archive anymore. He's had copies of the critical documents off-site for 2 years. What he needs is her, the only living witness who can place him in that room." He paused. "The transport isn't the objective. She is. He's moving the archive on a traceable route through a traceable corridor, making sure the information reaches people like you." He looked at Damian, "who have the resources to attempt an intercept. Because an intercept requires her to be present, it requires her to surface." The room was silent enough that Alara could hear the ventilation system and her own breathing and the faint sound of the whiteboard marker rolling against the tray where Croft had set it down. "He staged the leak," Damian said. "He staged the leak," Grund confirmed. "The prepaid phone, the messages warning her, all of it was designed to move her toward action rather than away from it. 14 years of keeping her managed and contained, and then the civil case files and the journalist, and suddenly she's a variable that containment can no longer handle." He stopped. "The only permanent solution is to remove her, but Ashford doesn't do direct, he never has. He creates conditions that cause other people to make the moves he needs." Alara listened to this with her hands in her lap and her feet flat on the floor, and a quality of internal stillness that she recognized as the place she went when the information was too large to react to, and the only functional response was to process it clean and fast, and without the interference of what it meant emotionally. "The person who sent me the warning messages," she said, "that wasn't Ashford's operation." Grund looked at her. A pause. "No." "Then who?" Another pause, longer. "Me," he said. The word landed in the room with a weight disproportionate to its size. "You warned her," Damian said. "I sent 2 messages from a burn phone I purchased 14 days ago in Caldwell, yes." Grund's jaw shifted. "I've been inside this estate for 18 months. I've been inside Ashford's network for 3 years. I know what he does with variables that become inconvenient. He looked at the whiteboard, at the list of witnesses, at the 2 confirmed dead. I was one of those variables once. I made a choice to survive it. I've spent 3 years wondering if that choice was going to mean watching someone else die for it. Croft said to Damian, without looking away from Grund, "He's either telling the truth, or this is the second layer of the trap." "I know," Damian said. "If he's the second layer, everything he just told us about the transport being bait is designed to make us stand down so the transport succeeds." "I know," Damian said again. Alara said, "It doesn't matter." Both men looked at her. "Whether the transport is bait or whether it's the real objective, the archive is on that truck either way. The witness log is on that truck either way." She looked at Grund. "The 6th witness, the 8-year-old, is that person alive?" Grund was quiet for a moment. "I don't know. But Ashford does." "If they're alive, yes. He tracks all of them." "Then the archive is the only way to identify them. Whether it's bait or not, we have to intercept it." She looked at Damian. "We just have to do it knowing it's a trap." Damian looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Croft. Croft said, "We have 66 hours. "Start the planning," Damian said. They worked through the night. Croft spread roadmaps and satellite images across the conference table. Printouts, not digital, because digital left traces, and what they were planning sat in a legal gray that Damian had acknowledged once and did not discuss again. The route from Ashford's primary holding facility to the Marin County storage installation ran 42 miles, the first 18 of which were highway before it dropped onto a 2-lane county road through terrain that was either an advantage or a liability, depending on how many people Ashford had waiting in it. Grund sat at the far end of the table. Not restrained, Damian had made the calculation that restraining him closed the information channel before they'd extracted everything it had to give. Croft had taken his phone and his earpiece and had given him coffee, which Grund drank without commenting on the gesture. Alara sat across from Grund and watched him the way she watched things she didn't trust. Not with hostility, but with complete and uninterrupted attention, cataloging the micro details, the way he held the cup, the direction his eyes moved when he was thinking versus when he was formulating. "The armed security on the convoy," she said. "How many?" 4 vehicles, lead car, 2 flanking, trail, 8 personnel minimum, possibly 12. He looked at the map. "Ashford uses a private contractor, Mercer Group, former military, legitimate licensing. They're not criminals. They're professionals who have been told they're protecting a legal commercial asset transfer." "So we can't engage them," Croft said. "If you engage them, you're assaulting private security personnel operating under what they believe is a legal contract. That becomes the story instead of the archive." Grund looked at Damian. "Ashford knows that. It's another layer." "We go around the convoy," Damian said. "There's a federal mechanism," Croft said. He had been working a second laptop for the last 2 hours, navigating through a set of contacts that he had not explained and that Alara had not asked about. "The civil case plaintiff's lead attorney is a woman named Sorrell, Margaret Sorrell. She's been trying to subpoena the Ashford archive for 4 months and keeps hitting sealed private property walls." He looked up. "If we can give her a location, a time, and a credentialed chain of custody mechanism, she can file an emergency preservation order through the federal court. It won't stop the convoy, not in 66 hours, but it creates a legal record that any transfer of the archive after the order is filed constitutes evidence tampering." "That's a paper deterrent," Alara said. "It's more than that. If Ashford's convoy is aware that a federal preservation order has been filed, the Mercer Group pulls out. They're professionals. They won't expose themselves to federal tampering charges for a client." Croft paused. "Ashford will know the order has been filed within an hour of it hitting the system. He'll have to make a decision, pull the convoy and leave the archive vulnerable, or proceed and expose his security contractors to federal liability." "He proceeds," Grund said. Everyone looked at him. "He proceeds with a smaller team, his own people, not Mercer." Grund set down the coffee cup. "I've worked for him for 3 years. He doesn't retreat from a finishing move. He adjusts the personnel and he continues." He looked at Croft. The preservation order is a good move. But when the convoy rolls, it's going to be Ashford's people in those vehicles, not Mercer Group contractors who don't know what they're carrying. How many? Damian said. 4, maybe 5. All of them knowing exactly what the job is. The room absorbed this adjustment. Then we need an intercept point, Damian said. Not engagement. Interception. Something that separates the archive from the personnel legally and cleanly enough that the chain of custody holds. Croft turned back to the map. He traced the county road with his finger. Mile marker 31. The road crosses a bridge over the Karen Creek drainage, single lane, weight restricted. The convoy has to slow to near stop to cross in sequence. He looked up. That's our window. Width, Damian said. 40 feet of bridge, 12 feet of road deck. One vehicle at a time. We can block the approach, said a voice Alara didn't recognize. She turned. In the doorway of the conference room stood a woman she had never seen. Mid-40s, dark coat still damp from outside, the kind of face that had spent a long time arranging itself to reveal nothing. She was carrying a leather document case and looking at the map on the table with the quick proprietary attention of someone who processes spatial information as a professional habit. Who are you? Alara said. Margaret Sorrell, the woman said. She looked at Alara directly. And you're Lena Marlowe. What? Sorrell had driven from the city in 4 hours flat after Croft's call, which told Alara something about the degree to which the civil case had been consuming her. She sat at the conference table with the document case open and papers spread in front of her, and she spoke quickly and without sentimentality, and Alara understood within the first 5 minutes that she was exactly the kind of person the situation required. Someone for whom the human dimension of the case was not irrelevant, but was also not going to interfere with the mechanical precision of what needed to happen legally. The preservation order I can file in 6 hours, Sorrell said. I've had the paperwork drafted for 2 months. I just needed a triggering event and a location. She looked at Croft. You're giving me the location. Mile marker 31, County Road 11, Marin County, Croft said. Transit window is approximately 36 hours from now, based on the departure schedule Grund gave us. Sorrell wrote it down. The federal order will hit Ashford's legal team before sunrise, which means by sunrise he knows we know. She looked at Alara. What I need from you is the recorded statement, tonight. Your legal name, your connection to the original case, your authentication of the archive as material evidence. She paused. You understand that once you make that statement on the record, the protection of anonymity you've maintained for 14 years is effectively dissolved. I understand, Alara said. There may be other consequences. If Ashford's team moves before we can secure the archive, you become the sole remaining evidentiary thread. That makes you a target in a way that's different from how you've been a target. I've been a managed variable, Alara said. I'd rather be a target. Sorrell looked at her for a moment. Something moved in her face. Not softness exactly, but recognition. All right, she said. She opened the document case and produced a small recording device. Let's do this now. Toss. It took 40 minutes. Alara sat at the end of the conference table with the recorder running, and Margaret Sorrell asking questions in the precise, sequential manner of someone who understood that the record had to be airtight, and she answered them. All of them. The building, the floor, the conference room, the 4 men, the documents, the payment amounts she remembered, the name Crane said aloud, the face at the head of the table. Victor Ashford. She said his name 6 times in 40 minutes, attached each time to a specific detail of what she had witnessed, and her voice did not waver and her hand stayed flat on the table, and she looked at the recorder rather than the people in the room because the recorder was the thing that mattered. At the end, Sorrell said, For the record, please state your legal name. The room was quiet. Alara looked at the recorder. Lena Marlowe, she said. It came out steady. It came out like a thing that had always been there, waiting to be used again. 34 hours later, at 11:40 at night, it was raining. Not the gentle, consistent rain of a weather system moving through, but the violent, directional rain of a storm that had been building over the coast for 2 days and had finally committed. Sheets of it, Wind-driven, the kind of rain that reduces visibility to 30 feet and turns road surfaces into something unreliable and fills drainage channels to the point where the Karen Creek under the Mile 31 bridge was running 6 feet above its normal level, audible from the road as a low, constant roar beneath the sound of the rain. Alara sat in the passenger seat of the second vehicle, a dark SUV with the headlights off, parked on the eastern approach to the bridge on a service road that connected to County Road 11 through a gap in a fence that Croft had identified on satellite 2 days ago. Damian was in the driver's seat. Croft was in a third vehicle further back, coordinating with Sorrell's legal team, who were in contact with federal marshals who had been briefed, reluctantly and at the last possible moment, by a judge who had reviewed Sorrell's preservation order and the attached statement and had authorized a witness protection detail that was now somewhere on County Road 11, moving from the west. Everything was in motion. All the pieces they had placed over 34 hours of planning were moving toward mile marker 31, and whether they held or collapsed would happen in the next 20 minutes. Alara's earpiece crackled, Croft's voice. Lead vehicle confirmed on County Road 11. 3 vehicles total, not 4. Mercer Group has withdrawn as predicted. These are Ashford's personnel. 3 vehicles, Damian said. Lead transport trail. 6 personnel estimated. Damian looked at Alara. Rain hammered the roof of the SUV with the intensity of something that had an opinion about the night. You stay in the vehicle, he said. No. Alara. Lena, she said. Tonight, I'm Lena. She looked at him. And I'm not staying in the vehicle. His jaw tightened. He looked at her in the darkness and rain, and she could see him running the argument and finding that every version of it collapsed against the particular quality of her expression, which was not reckless and not emotional. It was the settled, concrete look of someone who has made a decision by arriving at it from every direction and finding it holds from all of them. You stay behind me, he said. Agreed. Croft's voice again. Lead vehicle approaching bridge. They're slowing. Damian's hand went to the ignition. Ready. Ready, Alara said. The lead vehicle's headlights appeared at the far end of the bridge. White light diffused through rain into something almost formless, floating, moving slowly as the driver navigated the narrow deck. The bridge groaned under the weight of the creek below, a low structural sound that mixed with the rain and the wind into a pressure that you felt in your chest rather than heard with your ears. The lead vehicle crossed. It pulled onto the East Road approach and stopped. The transport vehicle moved onto the bridge. Damian pulled out of the service road, headlights on, and blocked the East Road approach. Everything happened fast. The lead vehicle's doors opened. 2 men, the rain hitting them immediately, hands going to weapons that they held but did not raise because the situation required assessment before escalation, and they were professionals enough to know that. Damian was out of the SUV, standing in the rain, his hands visible, and he said something that Alara couldn't hear over the rain and the creek and the bridge. She got out of the vehicle. The rain hit her like a physical thing, cold, immediate, soaking through her jacket in the first 5 seconds. She moved to Damian's right and slightly behind, the way she'd agreed. The 2 men from the lead vehicle looked at her and then looked back at Damian. The transport vehicle had stopped on the bridge. The driver had seen the blockage and stopped, which was correct procedure, which meant the trail vehicle behind it had also stopped, half on the bridge approach and half on the west road, which meant the convoy was segmented. The archive vehicle on the bridge, unable to go forward or back efficiently. The creek roared beneath the bridge deck. From somewhere on the west road, lights appeared. Not headlights. The particular rotating light of federal vehicles, blue-white in the rain. The marshals, moving in from the west, moving faster than Croft's estimated timeline. One of the 2 men in front of Damian said something into an earpiece. His expression changed. A door opened on the trail vehicle, west side of the bridge. A figure stepped out onto the road in the rain. Not one of the security personnel, someone else, someone who had been in the trail vehicle rather than the lead, which meant someone who was not part of the security team, someone who had been transported alongside the convoy rather than driving it. Alara saw the figure before she recognized the face. Then the headlights caught it. Victor Ashford walked across the bridge in the rain like a man who had arrived exactly where he intended to be. He was not armed. He was wearing a dark coat and moving with the unhurried quality of someone who had never once in his adult life been required to rush. and he walked past the stopped transport vehicle and past his own security personnel and stopped 10 feet from Alara on the rain-soaked road and looked at her with an expression that was almost composed. Almost. "Lena," he said, "you've grown up." The name in his mouth was different than it had been in Damian's. In Damian's mouth it had been careful, almost reverential, the handling of something that belonged to someone else. In Ashford's mouth it was a statement of ownership, the name of something he had managed for 14 years, a variable he had named and moved and contained, and hearing it from him produced in Alara a physical reaction she had not anticipated, a coldness in her chest that was not fear, but was its close neighbor. "Victor Ashford," she said. She said it clearly. She said it with the same flat, unshaking quality she had used 40 hours ago in a conference room with a recorder running. He looked at her with the patience of someone who has seen this kind of moment before and knows how it tends to resolve. "You've done something very foolish," he said. "You understand that." "I've done something on the record," she said. "That's different. Records can be challenged. Cases collapse. You know that better than anyone." "Last time you bought the judge," she said. "This time the preservation order is filed in federal court, and the statement is in 3 separate legal repositories, and the journalist in Caldwell has a copy of both." She paused. "Crane was a local judge. You'd need to buy a federal bench." Another pause. "That's a different kind of expensive?" Ashford's expression shifted slightly. The composure held, but something underneath it adjusted. The recognition, she thought, of a calculation that had returned a different number than expected. He looked past her at the blue-white lights moving in from the west on the county road. He looked at the SUV blocking his convoy's exit. He looked at Damian, who was standing in the rain saying nothing, because nothing he could add to the moment would improve it. "You can't win this," Ashford said. "I'm not trying to win," Alara said. "I'm trying to make sure you lose." Ashford looked at her. The rain came down between them, cold and relentless, and the creek roared under the bridge, and the marshal's lights were close enough now that their reflection was in the water on the road surface, blue-white pools that rippled every time the wind moved. One of Ashford's security personnel said something sharp, a warning, an alert, and the trail vehicle's doors opened, and Alara registered movement at the periphery, something that didn't match the geometry of the scene she'd been tracking, something coming from the tree line to the east of the road that should not have been there. And Damian's hand came down on her shoulder and moved her sideways with a force that was not gentle and did not ask permission, and the sound happened, sharp, directional, cutting through the rain and the creek noise, and the transport vehicle's rear window dissolved. Not a gunshot. A stone, thrown hard from the tree line. The safety glass cracked into a white spiderweb and held in its frame, but the impact produced a sound sharp enough that everyone on the bridge reacted to it as if it had been a shot. 2 of Ashford's personnel going to cover positions, the transport driver's door opening, a hand visible in the cab interior. In the 3 seconds of reorganization that followed, Croft came out of the tree line. He was not alone. The man beside him was someone Alara had not seen before, older, deliberate in movement, carrying a document case that matched Sorrell's, which meant he was either part of Sorrell's legal team or something adjacent to it. They walked onto the bridge from the east approach, past the transport vehicle's cracked rear window, and Croft went directly to the transport vehicle's cargo door and put his hand on the handle and looked at Ashford. "Federal preservation order," Croft said, in the rain, loudly and clearly. "This archive is now under court protection. Anyone who interferes with its chain of custody is in contempt of federal court." The marshal's vehicles reached the West Bridge approach. Ashford stood in the rain and looked at Croft's hand on the cargo door handle and at the marshals getting out of their vehicles with the deliberate, measured movements of people who were not going to rush and were not going to hesitate and had exactly the legal authority to do what they were about to do. His composure, Alara watched, did not break. It dissolved. Slowly, the way ice dissolves, the structure holding past the point when it should, and then giving way all at once in a way that can't be reversed. His face underneath it was not what she'd expected. It was not rage. It was not the cold calculation of a man adjusting to a setback. It was something older and more private, the specific expression of someone who has built everything on the certainty that a thing will not happen and is watching it happen. He looked at Alara. She held his gaze. She did not look away. She stood in the rain on the county road with the Karen Creek roaring underneath the bridge and the federal marshals crossing the bridge deck and Croft's hand on the archive cargo door, and she looked at the man who had seen her in a doorway at 12 years old and had spent 14 years deciding what to do with what he'd seen, and she let him look at her in return. "You should have let the case close," she said. Her voice was even. "In 2011, when it was dismissed, you had what you needed. You should have left us alone." Ashford said nothing. "You couldn't," she said. "Could you? You can't leave a variable you don't control. It's not about the case, or the money, or the network. You just can't stand a loose end." The first marshal reached them. He looked at Ashford. He looked at the two security personnel who had moved to cover positions. He said something procedural in the flat, practiced language of a man executing a legal order, and Ashford's security personnel, who were professionals and had just watched their principal's composure dissolve on a rain-soaked bridge in front of federal marshals, made the correct professional calculation and stood down. Croft opened the cargo door. Inside, stacked in fireproof cases, sealed with numbered locks, was the archive. 14 years of buried correspondence and suppressed testimony and erased identities and managed variables, and one sealed witness log that contained the identity of a child who had been 8 years old the night the conference room door wasn't fully closed. The second marshal took photographs. The man with the document case began establishing chain of custody in writing, on the bridge, in the rain. Alara turned away from Ashford. She walked to the cargo door and stood next to Croft and looked at the cases inside the transport vehicle. She looked at them the way you look at something that has been in a locked room for a very long time, with the particular quality of attention that comes from knowing the room has been there your whole life and knowing you are looking at the door of it for the last time before it opens. "The witness log," she said to Croft. "We'll have it in an hour." She nodded. Behind her, she heard the marshal saying something to Ashford about cooperation, about the nature of the legal process, about rights, and she heard Ashford's attorney, who had materialized from somewhere, the trail vehicle perhaps, because men like Ashford never moved without legal counsel in proximity, responding in the precise, layered language of someone whose job is to insert friction between a man and his consequences. She did not turn around. Damian appeared at her side. He was soaked through, his dark hair flattened by the rain, water running off his jaw, and he looked at the archive in the transport vehicle and then at her, and she could feel him wanting to say something that he was not saying, which she understood because she had the same thing, a pressure of words that the moment was too large to accommodate. She looked at him sidelong. He looked back. The rain came down. From the east side of the bridge, a marshal's radio crackled. A voice, coming through with the distortion of rain interference, saying something in fragments. Croft turned toward it. His expression shifted. He looked at Damian. Then he looked at Alara. "The sixth witness," he said. She turned fully. "They found a current address in the archive's index file," Croft said. "Ashford had been tracking them. They're alive." He paused. "They're 43 miles from here." Alara stood on the rain-soaked bridge with the archive open behind her and the marshals moving around the convoy and Ashford somewhere at her back being managed by his attorney. And she felt something she had not felt in so long she almost didn't recognize the shape of it. Not relief, not victory, not the specific closure she had told herself for years was what she was working toward. She felt something that was simply the absence of the thing that had been there so long she'd stopped noticing its weight. She looked at Croft. "Then we need to be there when they make contact," she said. The address was a rented house on the outer edge of a town called Ferris, which was the kind of town that existed primarily as a collection of necessary services, a gas station, a pharmacy, a diner with hand-lettered hours on the door, arranged around a crossroads that nobody had ever intended to be significant. 43 miles from the bridge took 48 minutes in the rain, with Croft driving and Alara in the passenger seat and Damian in the back. Nobody talking, the radio off, the only sound the rain on the roof and the tires on the wet road and the occasional crackle of Croft's phone as the marshal coordinating the welfare check relayed updates in the clipped procedural language of someone executing a task with no emotional investment in its outcome. The sixth witness had a current name. It was in the archive index, which Croft had photographed before the marshals sealed the cases, and the name was Daniel Voss. Alara heard it and was quiet for a long time. "Voss?" she said eventually. "Yes," Croft said. She looked out the passenger window at the rain-dark road. "That's my name. The name I built." But Croft said nothing. "Ashford's people built it," she said. It was not a question. She had already completed the logic before she finished the sentence. The private contractor, Palliser Security Solutions, building identities for witnesses, building them with overlapping elements because that was efficient. Because when you are manufacturing lives for people who are never supposed to find each other, you reuse components the way a factory reuses molds. She had spent 11 years as Alara Voss. Somewhere, a man who had been 8 years old in a building in Caldwell had spent some portion of his life with the same surname, not because they were connected, but because the people who had constructed their invisibility had used the same template. She felt something about this that she couldn't name. It wasn't irony. It was something more structural than that. The system that had erased them had also, without intending to, linked them. "How old is he now?" she said. 22. She did backward math. 22 now. 8 at the time of the relocation. The relocation was 14 years ago. The arithmetic was correct. She did it twice because she needed something to do with her hands, which were in her lap, and there was nothing to do with her hands. "He would have been in that building for a different reason than I was," she said. "His family. Someone in his family was connected to the Prine case." "His father was a city planning official," Croft said, "one of the 11 officials in the payment network. His father cooperated with investigators, turned evidence. The family was relocated as protected witnesses when the case was still expected to go to trial." He paused. When the case was dismissed, the cooperation agreement became worthless. Ashford's team reclassified them as liabilities. "His father," Alara said, "died in custody of a competing criminal matter 18 months after the relocation," Croft said. "The charges were filed by a prosecutor with documented connections to Aldgate, Reeves's former partner." Alara watched the road. The rain was easing slightly, still present but less violent, shifting from the battering quality it had held all night towards something more resigned and continuous. The headlights caught a road sign for Ferris, 4 miles. "He's been alone for a long time," she said. "Yes." She thought about being 18 and being handed a folder with a social security number and told that the threat assessment had been downgraded. She thought about what 22 looked like when you had been managing the specific weight of an erased past since you were 8 years old. She thought about 14 years and whether any of them had been real or whether they had all been the inside of a room with walls she couldn't see. "Don't send the marshal in first," she said. Croft glanced at her. "He doesn't know us. He doesn't know what's happening. If the first person through the door is a federal marshal at midnight in the rain, he runs." She looked at Croft. "He's been conditioned to run, the same way I was." Croft was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. The house was a beige rental with a covered porch and a light on in the front room and a truck in the driveway that was at least 10 years old. The kind of house that had been chosen for the same reasons Alara had chosen every place she'd lived. Sufficient anonymity, sufficient exits, sufficient distance from anywhere that mattered. She knocked. 3 beats. Unhurried. The way Croft knocked. Nothing for 20 seconds. Then the sound of movement inside. Careful, measured, the sound of someone who was checking before committing to approach. A window curtain moved. She stood where the porch light could reach her face, and she did not step back from it. The door opened on a chain. A face in the gap. Young, tired in the specific way that is not the tiredness of one bad night, but of sustained pressure over a long period. Dark eyes. A jaw that had not finished becoming what it was going to be. He looked at her with the flat, assessing attention of someone who had learned early that assessment preceded everything. He looked at her the way she looked at things she didn't trust. "Daniel Voss," she said. The face in the gap did not confirm or deny. "Who are you?" "My name is Lena Marlowe," she said. "Until tonight, I was Alara Voss." A long silence. The rain came down on the porch roof. "That's my name," he said. "I know. We were given the same one by the same people. I found out tonight." She looked at him through the gap, at the young face with the old eyes, and she kept her hands visible and her voice even. Someone tried to destroy the evidence that connects both of us to a case that was buried 14 years ago. We stopped them tonight. The archive is in federal custody. A preservation order is filed. She paused. And there are people in a car at the end of your street who need to speak with you about what comes next. But I asked them to let me come first. The chain stayed on. Why? Because I know what it's like when the first person through the door is someone you don't choose, she said. The silence stretched. She could hear him breathing on the other side of the door. She could hear the rain. She could hear, somewhere inside the house, the particular quality of quiet that is not emptiness, but the organized silence of someone who keeps their space controlled because control is the thing they have. The chain came off. He opened the door and stood in it and looked at her. All of her. The same complete inventory she had been running on everyone since she was 12. And she let him look, the way Damian had let her look at him in that first study meeting, because looking was the beginning of deciding, and deciding required evidence, and she was not going to give him less than the full picture. "Come in," he said. It cost him something. She could see it. She came in. They sat in his kitchen, which was clean and sparse, and had a small table with 2 chairs, suggesting a life that had not anticipated guests. He made coffee without asking whether she wanted it, which she recognized as the same habit she had, giving your hands a task when you don't know what to do with them. She sat at the table and watched him move around the kitchen with the careful efficiency of someone who has reduced their physical environment to only what functions. She told him everything, not the way she'd told it to the recorder, sequentially, and with the precision of legal testimony, the way you tell something to another person who already knows the interior of the same house you grew up in. She told him about the building and the corridor and the conference room and the dismissal and the relocation and the name she'd been given that turned out to be his name, and she told him about Blackthorn Estate and the collision in the corridor and the message at 11:42 and the bridge in the rain. He listened the way she listened. It's without interruption, without performing reaction, absorbing it clean. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "The archive," he said. "My father's cooperation agreement. Is it in there?" "Yes." "His testimony, what he said about the network?" "Yes." He looked at his coffee. "He died because he cooperated," he said. "Not in spite of it, because of it. Ashford got to the prosecutor, and the prosecutor got to the case, and the case got to my father inside a county facility where he had no protection and no one left to call." He said it without the quality of fresh grief. It had been processed long enough to become geology, something under everything else, rather than on the surface of it. "I was 9 when he died. I was told it was complications from a medical condition." "I know," Alara said. "I'm sorry." He looked up. "Don't apologize for what they did." "I'm not apologizing for what they did. I'm sorry that you were 9 years old and nobody told you the truth." He held her gaze for a moment. Something in his face shifted. Not dramatically, barely perceptibly, the way ground shifts before you can see the crack. "What happens to the case now?" "Sorrel, the attorney handling the civil case. She has your father's cooperation records as of tonight. The federal preservation order protects them. The criminal case that killed him can be reopened because the prosecutorial misconduct is documented in correspondence that was in that archive." She paused. "It won't give you your father back, but it will put the right name on what happened to him." He was quiet again. He turned his coffee cup slowly on the table, a small rotation, back and forth. "The civil case. I'm named in it? You'll be notified. Sorrel's team will reach out in the next few days. You don't have to do anything you don't choose to do." "I've been Voss for 14 years, he said. "I've been careful. I've been quiet. I've done everything I was supposed to do to stay off the map." He looked at her. "Did any of it matter? Were we ever actually hidden?" She thought about the room with invisible walls. She thought about the honest answer, which was, no, not entirely, not in the way they had been told. She thought about whether the honest answer served him or hurt him. She gave him the honest answer. "No," she said, "not completely. Ashford's contractor built the covers, and Ashford kept the keys. But she stopped, chose the next words with care. The running mattered. Not because it kept us hidden, because it kept us alive and functional until the moment when we could do something other than run. He considered this. That's a generous interpretation. It's the one I need, she said. You can decide what interpretation you need. For the first time, something in his face moved towards something that was not quite a smile but occupied the same general territory. The specific expression of someone who has just encountered an honesty they weren't prepared for and don't know yet whether to trust it. Lena Marlowe, he said, testing the name. Yes. Is that who you are now? She thought about the recorder and the bridge and Ashford's face in the rain and the cargo door and everything in the cases behind it. She thought about the corridor in Blackthorn Estate and the moment before she opened the door to Croft's knock, when she had looked at herself in the mirror for 3 seconds and seen the complete architecture of Alara Voss looking back at her, intact and functional and built from nothing over 11 careful years. I'm still figuring that out, she said, but it's where I'm starting from. He nodded once, slowly. The nod of someone who understands the distinction between a starting point and an answer. She brought Croft in at 1 a.m. Daniel opened the door for him without the chain, which was not nothing. Ashford was taken into federal custody at 4:17 in the morning at a hotel in Marin County where he had, apparently, booked a room, either in expectation of a celebratory night or as a contingency position, the distinction being irrelevant given that he never got to use it for either purpose. The arrest was documented, procedural, and conducted by federal marshals with enough paperwork to make it permanent. His attorney filed 4 motions before sunrise. None of them were immediately successful. The Mercer Group issued a statement the same morning distancing themselves from the operation. Their cooperation with the investigation was complete and immediate, because professionals do not go down for clients who did not tell them the full nature of the work. Patrick Grund gave a formal statement to federal investigators at 7 a.m. that lasted 4 hours. In exchange for his cooperation, Sorrell negotiated a reduction in his exposure that reflected the fact that his last independent act inside Ashford's network had been to warn the primary target rather than facilitate her capture. The federal investigators were not sentimental about this, but they were practical. The archive was opened under federal supervision over the course of 2 days. The witness log contained 8 names, not 6. 2 of those names corresponded to the confirmed deaths Croft had already identified. The remaining 6 were alive. Daniel Voss was 22 and lived in Ferris. The others were scattered across 4 states, living the same careful, invisible lives, making the same daily calculation of how visible was too visible, some of them not knowing why they had always made that calculation, only knowing that they had always made it. Sorrell's team began the process of notification. It was, she told Alara in a phone call 2 weeks after the bridge, slower than she had anticipated and harder than she had anticipated, because some of them had built lives that required careful dismantling before the truth could be integrated into them, and there was no version of that dismantling that didn't cost something. How do you tell someone, Sorrell said, that the ground they built on was false, without making them feel that everything they built is therefore false? You tell them the building is real, Alara said, even if the ground isn't what they thought. Sorrell was quiet for a moment. Is that what you're telling yourself? It's what I'm working toward, Alara said. 3 months after the bridge, Harwell Crane, the judge who had dismissed the case in 2011, died of a cardiac event in his home in Aldgate County. He was 71. The federal case connected to the Prine suppression was ongoing at the time of his death. His attorney released a statement saying he had intended to cooperate fully with investigators. The investigators made no public comment on this claim. The Reeves estate continued to yield documentation. Bernard Reeves, as it turned out, had been a man who kept records the way some people collect them, compulsively, thoroughly, with the specific vanity of someone who cannot quite believe they will not eventually be in a position to use the records for leverage. He had been wrong about that, but the records were exquisite, and they continued to surface in the federal investigation for months after the initial archive seizure. Damian Valehart retained separate legal counsel to handle the portion of the investigation touching on his father's involvement. He did not attempt to suppress any of it. He did not attempt to distance himself from the findings. He sat in 2 separate federal interviews and answered every question put to him with the same flat, factual brevity he brought to everything. And when the interviews were complete, he walked out of the federal building and into the parking structure and sat in his car for 11 minutes before he drove away. Alara knew this because Croft told her, and Croft told her because he thought she should know. And she thought she should know because she had spent 3 months understanding that the man who had sat across from her in a conference room in the small hours and told her he had not known what he was inheriting was telling the truth. And that the truth, in this case, was not a simple thing to live with. She went to the estate once, in the 4th month. Not because she had resumed her position. She had not, formally, and the question of what her position was had been set aside by mutual unspoken agreement during the period when there were more urgent questions. She went because there were things she had left in her room, and because going back to a place you left in a crisis and seeing it in ordinary light was something she had learned to do deliberately rather than avoid. The corridor was the same. The marble, the recessed lighting, the console table with the angular lacquer sculpture that she had knocked to the floor on the 43rd day. She stood in the corridor for a moment and felt the geometry of it. The 40 feet, the closed double doors at the far end, the quality of quiet that a well-built interior maintains regardless of what has happened in it. Damian found her there. She didn't hear him approach, which was unusual. She heard most things, and she registered his presence only when he stopped at the far end of the corridor and didn't speak. She looked at him. He looked at her. The distance between them was roughly what it had been on the morning of the collision, and neither of them moved to close it or increase it. "Your room is as you left it," he said. "Heloise hasn't reassigned it." "I noticed." "I didn't ask her not to. She made the decision." "I know," Alara said. "Heloise makes decisions." A pause. The corridor held its quiet. "The legal foundation Croft is setting up," Damian said. "The support structure for relocated witnesses. The people Sorrell's team is identifying." He stopped. "I want to fund it. Not as a gesture, as a structural commitment, legal advocacy, identity documentation support, case connection for people who were relocated without full information about what they were being relocated into." He looked at her. "I want it to be real. Not a press release. It is something that functions." She looked at him for a moment. "That's a large commitment for someone whose father's name is in the federal investigation." "Yes," he said. "That's partly why it needs to be real and not a press release." She understood. She understood the distinction he was making and the specific kind of integrity it required, not the self-exonerating gesture of a man performing atonement, but the practical ongoing commitment of someone who has looked at the full accounting of what was inherited and decided that the liability column requires active, sustained work to address. It was not absolution. It was function. And function, she had learned, was what distinguished the things that lasted from the things that looked like they would. "I'll help you build it," she said, "if you want that." He looked at her. "That's not a small offer." "No," she said, "it's not." The corridor held them for another moment, and then Alara walked the 40 feet to the console table and straightened the lacquer sculpture, which was slightly off-center. Had probably been slightly off-center since the morning she'd knocked it to the floor, and someone had replaced it without quite getting it right. She straightened it and stepped back and looked at it and found it satisfactory. She picked up the small bag she had set by the wall and walked to the south end of the corridor, toward the staircase, toward her room and the things she had left in it. Daniel Voss. He kept the name in the end because it was the one he'd built 14 years of himself inside, and rebuilding a name from scratch at 22 was a cost he evaluated and decided against. Testified in the civil proceedings 4 months after the bridge. He sat in a deposition room with Sorrell across the table and a federal recorder running, and he gave his statement in the same flat, compressed way he had listened to Alara in his kitchen. And when it was over, he walked out of the building and stood on the sidewalk for a while in the pale winter light. Not going anywhere, just standing. Alara was there. She had not told him she would be, but she had been there since the deposition started, sitting in a plastic chair in the lobby with a bad cup of coffee, waiting. When he came out, she stood up, and he saw her through the glass doors and stopped for a moment, And then he pushed through the doors and came to stand beside her. "How was it?" she said. "Strange," he said. "Saying it out loud in a room where someone writes it down. It feels different than just knowing it." "Yes," she said, "it does." They stood on the sidewalk together in the winter light, not looking at each other, looking at the street. A normal street. Cars, a woman walking a dog, a delivery truck double-parked with its hazards going. The ordinary machinery of a day that did not know anything particular had happened in the building behind them. "I've been thinking about the name," Daniel said. "Voss? And?" "I think you should keep it," he said. "If you want it." He looked at her sidelong. "We didn't choose it, but we were both inside it for a long time. That's something." She thought about it. The name Alara Voss. The name she had built 11 years of clean, careful life inside. The name that had sat in a Linden agency file and passed a commercial background check and brought her to a marble corridor in a gated estate on a road that didn't appear on mapping applications. She thought about the name Lena Marlowe, which she had said on a bridge in the rain with a federal recorder going, and the Karen Creek roaring under the bridge deck, and Victor Ashford's composure dissolving in front of her. She thought about who she was when she was neither of them, the space between the names where she lived. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded. They stood on the sidewalk in the winter light, and after a while he said he had to drive back, and she said she knew, and he stood for one more moment before he moved. "Lena," he said. She looked at him. "Thank you for knocking first," he said. She held his gaze. "I know what it's like when nobody does," she said. He nodded once. Then he walked to his truck, the old one, 10 years at minimum, the truck of someone who valued function over signal, and he got in and he drove. She watched until the truck was gone around the corner. She stood on the sidewalk alone, and she did not cry, and she did not perform steadiness. She was simply present in the winter light, in the ordinary street, with the ordinary sound of the city around her, and she breathed in, and she breathed out, and she let the moment be exactly the size it was. No larger, no smaller, not the end of something as much as the first day of a different kind of accounting. She had run for 14 years, not from cowardice, from the correct rational understanding that running was survival, and survival was the necessary precondition for everything else. She had been right about that. She had been right to run, and right to be careful, and right to build the rooms she'd built inside the name she'd been given, brick by brick, without sentimentality or drama. And she had been right, on a rain-soaked bridge at midnight, to stop. She turned and walked, not away from anything, not toward anything in particular, just the deliberate forward movement of a woman using her own legs to go where she had decided to go, in a city that did not know her name, either of her names, and did not need to. The city moved around her with its indifferent, constant motion, and she moved through it, and the winter light fell on her the same way it fell on everything else, without distinction, without preference. She had a meeting with Sorrell at 2 o'clock to discuss the structure of the Legal Support Foundation. She had a phone call with Croft at 4 to review the first operational draft of the intake process for relocated witnesses seeking case reconnection. She had, in the small notebook she kept in her jacket pocket, a list of 7 things she intended to do before the week was out, none of them dramatic, all of them concrete and functional and connected to something that would outlast the doing of them. She had a name that she was still deciding what to do with. She had a corridor and an estate on a private road that she had cleaned for 43 days before anyone looked at her long enough to see that she was there. She had, against the odds of the last 14 years and the specific, deliberate efforts of a man who had spent 2 decades making sure that she would not, a future that was hers to construct. She walked. The city moved around her. She did not look back.